I recognize this gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for appearing today. And, Mr. Chairman, I thank you especially for holding this hearing. This issue is so vitally important to the national security of our country, and I think possibly, ultimately, the survival of our species. The New York Times had a bestseller for a while. It's called 1 Second After by William Forstchen. I assume you all have read that before?
No.
Oh, well, because I was, my next question was going to be, could you find any inconsistencies with the reality in the book? The book allegedly was written a novel based on a congressional intelligence report on the EMP threat, and it's staggering.
So, would you want me to?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that question? Okay. So, yeah, it was a novel, and so there were liberties taken, and they did base this on classified information, which I don't have access to. But when we now analyze what the impact would be, and this is what we call a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, detonated 7-10 miles above the Earth. We know that there were some relays that are going to be affected, but not all. We know that some computers, some communication systems are going to be impacted, but not all. And it is possible and likely that there could be blackouts. But then there's a recovery, and there's things you can do to recover more quickly.
Okay. Dr. Baker mentioned the solar flare that we avoided. I think it crossed the path of our orbit about 2 weeks. If we had been about 2 weeks further ahead, it would have been very serious consequences. You talked about it being in trillions of dollars. Could you quantify that just in a couple of brief sentences, the kind of impact that would have had on everyday life?
Well, I think, yes, it was missed the Earth by about 1 week, about 7 days, 6 or 7 days. If it occurred about a week earlier or so, it would have certainly hit the Earth. That would have been the kind of scenario that I think, would most dread. It would be a huge impact on the power grid. It would stand the chance of knocking out a number of the large, extremely high voltage transformers on the backbone. We don't know how many. We don't know exactly the failure modes, but the $2 trillion really comes from looking at if one is without electrical power for weeks or months or extending into a time scale of a year or so, that this really then starts to be in the trillion of dollars kind of cost.
What kind of damage do you think it would have done to our satellite system?
Well, that's the other component of this, which I'm glad to have the chance to respond to here, is that it's not just the effects on the power grid directly, it's also the effects on satellites, the timing that we get from the global positioning systems, which feeds into the other systems. It's the communication. It's all the things that we rely on. If all of those start to collapse, and they start to collapse in sequence, then we are facing, I think, a kind of a society that we haven't seen for decades or 100 years. We're sent back to very primitive kind of conditions.
I commend to you the book, 1 Second After. And,
I will.
And the consequence, if it takes out enough satellites, you don't have a weather report, you don't have a news report, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a laptop, you don't have a car that works, you don't have, I mean, you're just out of business, and it is very, very, very primitive. And the threat is real, as you mentioned. It's incredibly real.
That's right.
Are any of you aware of any technology to more or less have a super, for lack of a better term, circuit breaker that can detect an EMP threat in advance and shut the system down, whether it be on a satellite or on a generator? Or are any of you aware of that?
I'd say if you get hit with an EMP, the rise time of that impact is faster than any electronics device could respond to. I assert.
Okay.
Couple of things. We were sort of disparaging about the technology in some early Soviet fighters until we figured out that the reason they were using vacuum tubes rather than solid state was precisely to be EMP resilient. We have an annual doctoral qualifying exam in our department, and we used a 2X Carrington event exam. Carrington event was the largest measured solar mass ejection as the subject for the exam this past year, and the focus was on the resilience of emergency communication. You know, if you're using fiber optics and you've hardened stuff at both ends, the fiber optics are going to be resilient to this. So it really is a matter of looking carefully across the system for potential vulnerabilities. And as you heard in the case of the first testimony, if I back off the loading of the transformers, for example, so the cores are not saturated, I'm far less likely to fry them. And I can do other things like capacitive coupling and some other. So the answer is there are strategies.
Yeah, there are people who now are working on a high-speed technology to detect it and super high-speed react to it, but there just seems to be, believe it or not, no demand for it, which kind of amazes me. But.
Well, to just say again what I said before, which is to get a widespread EMP from a nuclear device, it has to be a high-altitude burst, and if we have an adversary that engages in a high-altitude burst, I think EMP may be the least of our problems, because I presume it will be combined with a whole lot of surface bursts, which will mean only a major nuclear exchange is likely to lead us to that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of time, so thank you for your graciousness.